Hello everyone and welcome to the second online lecture in our course Demography, Global Migration and Contemporary Cities. In this lecture we expand on migration but narrow our lens to its principal destination, that is cities, and especially the largest metropolitan areas. We will examine why urban centers attract the majority of movers between and within the countries by offering diverse opportunities, and how these same dynamics generate various forms of intra-urban inequalities. By the end of the lecture, you should be able to explain the main mechanisms that bring both international and internal migrants into the cities, as well as away from them to suburban and rural locations, and to recognize how cities change as a result of migration. In today's lecture, we will cover the following topics. We begin with the big picture by providing the world urbanization in numbers. The second topic focuses on large cities and intra-urban inequalities. We will frame the course around the triple dilemma: economic dynamism, social equity, and environmental sustainability. Throughout the course, our emphasis will be on inequality and segregation in general, and housing and climate change in particular. Let us start with the key figures of global urban population change. We are living at a time of massive urbanization. The process began roughly in the middle of the 19th century in Europe. It accelerated in the second half of the 20th century and will likely continue till the end of 21st century. Europe, together with South America and North America, are the most urbanized regions of the world, while other continents and regions are urbanizing today at the fastest rate. The process of world urbanization ends once Africa will also become a predominantly urbanized continent. In our opening lecture, we discussed about the concept of inertia effects when examining population change in China. And the idea was that demographic processes continue to unfold even after the main driving factors have slowed down or even reversed. The same principle applies to urbanization. As we look at this graph, we can immediately notice that rural population has already stabilized. In fact, it has not grown since the 1980s or for almost half a century by now. Yet, the urban population continues to increase. And the reason lies in the multiple sources of urban growth and the change of them as time goes on. Urban growth typically begins with rural to urban migration, as people leave the countryside in search of work and better living standards. Urbanization is also accompanied by the rising of wealth, since the jobs in industry and services that are provided in the cities generally produce higher incomes and salaries compared to traditional jobs in agriculture and forestry in the countryside. As countries urbanize, the potential for internal outmigration gradually diminishes, since there are simply less and less people living in the countryside. At the same time, the expansion of higher paying jobs start to attract immigrants also from abroad. At a certain point, therefore, international migration becomes a new and often dominant source of urban population growth. Today, most large cities on each continent are drawing immigrants. And because most migrants, both immigrants and domestic migrants, are young, fertility also fuels urban growth, even when urban families are smaller, that is, having less children in one family compared to rural families. This structural age composition effect, the fact that cities attract mainly young people, creates these long-term inertia effects and allows urban populations to continue to rise over extended periods of time. Let us now turn to the topic of intra-urban inequalities, that is an inherent feature of large cities. These differences are something that we have to admit, but they are also something that we have to deal with if we seek for more just cities that provide opportunities to their diverse residents. Cities draw people mainly for economic reasons. They bundle educational, economic, and other opportunities into dense spaces where ideas and talent mix. And as Edward Glaser argues in his book The Triumph of the City, published in 2011, cities are engines of economic growth. Proximity accelerates learning, innovation, and productivity, yielding faster wage growth and richer cultural life than less densely populated places. Yet, urban growth routinely produces uneven outcomes. As Carl Nightingale shows in his book Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, published in 2012, cities have been unequal and spatially segregated since their earliest beginnings. Without deliberate policy, access to urban opportunities remains highly uneven, and large concentrations of poverty often cluster in cities along with wealth and affluence. Cities also face a sustainability dilemma. Historically, they emerged as spaces of production, concentrating large, polluting factories. Urban clustering raises demand for new housing, infrastructure, and facilities, and the rapid spread of these concrete structures in cities has been one of the major drivers of energy use, carbon emissions, and thus global climate change. Over time, as residents are growing more affluent, cities evolve from sites of production to sites of consumption, and that is equally environmentally harmful. Carlos Moreno addresses these challenges in his book The 15-Minute City, a solution to saving our time and our planet, proposing a mobility-centered approach in which everyday needs, work, school, care, shopping, leisure, and so on, are reachable by short walk or bike ride, thus cutting mobility-related emissions and reducing the carbon footprint of the cities. But delivering this vision at scale collides with equity goals. Densification and retrofit can reduce carbon emissions and commute times, yet they elevate also house prices and elevate the risk of displacement that may lengthen rather than reduce trips as people cannot afford to live close to their jobs. This would raise rather than reduce mobility-related emissions. The task of urban planning and policy, therefore, is not to choose one priority over the other, but to manage their tensions, to harness agglomeration for broad-based advancement and economic growth, reduce inequality and segregation through inclusive housing market policies, and redesign urban form and services so that low-carbon 15-minute living does not bring along unintended consequences, such as widening of inequality or lengthening of commutes for those who are priced out of the cities. For the next seminar, I kindly ask you to watch Professor Moreno's talk on the 15-minute city so that we can discuss how such an idea might help to balance the triple dilemma faced by contemporary cities. Alternatively, you can also read the article that summarizes the main ideas of the 15-minute city. In short, the world's population is increasingly clustering in large cities, and many key inequality-related challenges and inequality must be addressed there as well. As geographers, we are particularly interested in the spatial patterns of opportunity and inequality, or in other words, where and how inequality appears in urban space. When we take a broad look at intra-urban inequalities in contemporary cities, they can be visualized as follows. On the horizontal axis of this figure, we have spatial segregation, or how unevenly different population groups, for example based on income, are distributed across the urban neighborhoods. It shows whether rich and poor households are mixed together or live in different neighborhoods. And on the vertical axis, we have income inequality, or the overall difference in income levels between the people living in the same city. What we do generally see is that income inequality has increased in most cities during the last few decades. As a rule, cities also tend to be much more unequal compared to the other parts of the country. Now, if we look at where affluent households tend to concentrate spatially, we can identify a few important patterns. Firstly, traditional city centers, or also called inner cities, are undergoing major transformations, and they act as magnets for affluence by attracting both investments, high-end housing, and amenities. These central districts often combine remnants of old industrial uses and working class housing, together with new residential and commercial developments that gradually replace them in the course of the process that is called gentrification. The process of gentrification has two phases. On the one hand, it is related to people. As higher income households move in, they displace lower and also middle income residents as house prices and rents rise in the central parts of the cities. On the other hand, it brings also broader changes in the built environment and activities, as urban renewal brings new functions such as offices, upscale services, and new activities that replace more traditional industries and shops. The outcome is quite a drastic change in both the urban fabric as well as people and residents. Like inner cities, waterfront areas also act as magnets of affluence. Cities tend to push their borders beyond the shorelines and build artificial islands and other land extensions that extends to the aquatorium. The most iconic example is the Dubai Palm Jumeirah. Most other cities located at waterfront are characterized by large waterfront developments as well. These developments serve multiple aims. With them, cities aim to unlock premium coastal real estate, expand tourism capacity with signature hotels and marinas, and branding the city more generally with instantly recognizable silhouettes. Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, is no exception in this respect. The city has claimed land when the city expanded from the center towards east to the Pirita district. The waterfront developments from the city center towards Põhja-Tallinn district is called the Golden Mile, characterized by expensive luxury housing and urban amenities that stretch along the waterfront. The parallel process to gentrification in inner cities and waterfront developments is what we call a suburbanization of poverty. This process refers to the moving of lower income families as well as middle income families away from inner cities as they are priced out from the city center and are forced to seek residence further away from the centers in areas where housing is more affordable. At the same time, suburbs themselves also change. While some are attractive, low-rise family neighborhoods, as they always have been, others are more densely populated with more affordable housing and attracting lower-income families. As a result, suburbs tend to be even more segregated than are the core cities. To summarize, cities today display multiple layers of spatial opportunity and intra-urban inequality across waterfronts, city centers, and suburbs of different types. The exact form varies depending on each city's history, housing structure, demographic composition, and migration patterns. We'll focus on these processes and different urban neighborhoods when implementing population projections in 5 districts of Tallinn, and we will also visit them during the excursion. These districts include city center, then waterfront development in Põhja-Tallinn, the biggest affordable housing area Lasnamäe, then old detached housing area Pirita, and the new suburban development with more expensive housing in Viimsi. Cities do not function on their own, but they are part of the wider settlement system where people make choices on where to live when they seek homes, jobs, and other opportunities. Although cities are growing, residential choices of people are much more diverse and complex and target both cities, suburbs, smaller towns, and rural areas. In making residential choices, individual characteristics matter. For example, income directly affects the opportunities of people on the housing market, but age and life course stage are equally important. People's mobility and residential preferences evolve as their life course proceeds. Young adults value different things than those forming families and raising children, and preferences shift yet again in later life. Without understanding these motivations and how they change over the life course, it is difficult to design cities that truly support people's needs, both in terms of housing, but also in terms of access to jobs, schools, and other opportunities. To make sense in this diversity of moves, we can distinguish 2 main processes that characterize migration flows in the whole nationwide settlement system. These are urbanization and counter-urbanization. Urbanization refers to the residential clustering of people in cities. It can be also shown graphically as a process whereby people move away from lower levels of the settlement system, from rural areas and small towns to larger cities. Counter-urbanization, on the other hand, is the opposite process that refers to the dispersal of people away from larger metropolitan areas towards smaller towns and rural settlements. Hermanus Geyer and Thomas Kontuli have proposed a model of differential urbanization to explain these processes. They show that 2 broad sets of motives shape the balance between urbanization and counter-urbanization. And the relationship and balance becomes more diverse and complex the more urbanized the country already is. Productionist motives relate to factors such as education and jobs, and these are the ones that tend to drive urbanization. Environmentalist motives, in contrast, fuel the opposite moves away from cities, as people search for larger or more affordable housing, cleaner air, quieter neighborhoods, green spaces, and lower exposure to heat, noise, or congestion that are all the key characteristics of large cities. Which set of motives dominates depends on many factors, including the age structure of the population. As migration motives shift over the life course, the country's age structure thus also shapes the balance between these 2 sets of motives, and thus also the balance of the flows to the big cities and away from them. Young adults prioritize study and jobs and so are pulled by the big cities. People in the family ages and also in the older ages tend to move away. However, these patterns may differ also along other population groups, for example by ethnic groups. Immigrants, for example, tend to be younger than the native-born people, and thus their migration and residential mobility tends to foster urbanization as well. In contrast, native-born population is typically older and therefore also more visible in the counter stream that moves away from larger cities to the smaller towns or rural areas. In short, different population groups may move in different directions, and thus the group sizes affect directly the direction of migration flows. Let's visualize this with two contrasting cases. These are Syria and Germany. Syria has a very young age structure, and Germany, by contrast, is a very old population. In youthful countries like Syria, the urban pull factors are the strongest. Urbanization prevails as young people move to cities for education, jobs, and networks. In countries with older population like Germany, the demographic potential for rural to urban migration is much smaller, and the internal migration flows become more diversified. Let me wrap this up with a simple takeaway. Nationwide flows of internal migration boil down to two things. First, relates to preferences, and these preferences differ by population groups, for example, by age, income, or ethnic origin. Second, population composition matters equally, since the share of different groups in the overall population also shape in which direction the dominant flows are running. If a country has a large share of young adults, urbanization is stronger, and when the share of older people is very high in the population, the urban pull factors are easing and moves get diversified. In short, whether urbanization or counter-urbanization prevails depends both on the residential preferences of different population groups and also on how many people are in each of the group. Finally, there is a third type of internal migration known as suburbanization, and this process refers to moves from major cities to their surrounding suburbs. These moves are more localized on the one hand, as they remain within the labor and housing market areas of large metropolitan regions. On the other hand, suburbanization, a process that also is called as urban sprawl, is increasing in size and becoming spatially more extensive over time as large cities disperse further and further away from their urban cores. Because many jobs remain concentrated in large cities, the outcome is the exact opposite of the 15-minute city ideal. That is, longer commuting distances and commuting times, and often also a greater car dependence. Estonia offers a good example, especially around Tallinn. These are the two maps that compare commuting patterns in Estonia at the time of last two censuses that took place in 2011 and 2021. The blue areas show from where people commute to Tallinn, and the darker the blue is, the larger the number of commuters is as well. What we can immediately see is that both the number of commuters from existing neighborhoods and municipalities has increased on the one hand, but also the spatial reach of Tallinn's commuting zone has grown sharply. And the catchment area of Tallinn now stretches across much of northern and western Estonia and covers almost half of the country. In short, Tallinn urban region has expanded significantly, pulling workers from ever farther locations and intensifying long-distance commuting. Let us now look at the motives behind the processes in a more greater detail. We already know that urbanization is primarily driven by opportunities that cities offer. However, what we often assume is that urbanization is something that is strongly related to work and job search processes. However, it is important to understand that education is usually the initial trigger for long-distance migration, as young people living all across the country pour to the few university towns. There have been initiatives to decentralize higher education institutions and to establish universities also in smaller towns to reduce depopulation in smaller cities and rural areas, but these efforts have generally not been very successful. It is simply difficult to maintain strong educational and research institutions in small places. Hence, large cities act as escalator regions. They attract people who want to improve their lives, to improve their education and get higher paying jobs, and they also move them up, which means that spatial mobility to the cities comes along with social mobility as people get better educated and earn higher incomes. The outmigration of young people is, of course, a challenge from a regional policy perspective, and it's a challenge for the future of the countryside. And this has to be addressed. Yet, from the standpoint of individuals and also from the standpoint of national economies, urbanization helps to concentrate activities and to accumulate wealth both at individual level and at the national level in general. The clustering of people into cities happens because of the opportunities cities provide. However, housing is the key factor that often makes people to think about alternative places of where to live. For many families, suburbs promise what cities struggle to offer: larger homes, private yards, quieter streets, cleaner air, easy access to green spaces, and so on. These are all environmentalist motives, and these preferences for calmer and healthier living environment is becoming more and more important as cities expand. It happens because of three interconnected reasons. First of all, simply the population numbers in cities are growing and people seek alternative locations of where to live. Secondly, life course changes trigger suburbanization as well. And finally, wealthier people also seek more spacious homes, especially in the recent years, as people also have started to work remotely from home. There is a demand for bigger homes. Suburbs thus offer often the best compromise between the desirable living environment on the one hand, places where it is good to raise children while still maintaining proximity to jobs and other important urban opportunities. In recent years, urban housing costs have surged, not only because of internal migration and immigration, but also because of other reasons. Apartments that used to be homes are increasingly treated also as assets, purchased for investment or converted to short-term rentals in platforms such as Airbnb and Booking. This contributes to the pushing up of house prices and rents in cities and pushes also lower income and middle income families away from the cities and leads to the suburbanization of poverty. Taking together all these different factors tend to intensify suburbanization in metropolitan areas around the world. Tallinn again is a good case, where suburbanization has significantly accelerated during the past 10 years, and only since 2015 the number of suburban residents has risen by about 25%, or much faster than the population has grown in the urban core. Also, as already we understand, this intensification of suburbanization takes place in two broad forms, and the balance between these two forms may differ in different urban regions. The first is the suburbanization of affluence, and this is mainly a preference-driven move for larger homes and quieter environments. And as social mobility unfolds, this type of mobility has increased as well. This is the classic North American style of urban sprawl, and it appears in many other regions of the world as well, but typically in a bit denser suburban forms. And second is the suburbanization of poverty, as lower and also middle income families are increasingly pushed out from the cities where house prices and rents have skyrocketed. These residential patterns also shape spatial inequality and segregation, especially when the two housing types, detached higher-end housing and affordable housing, are concentrated in different parts of the suburbs. Indeed, suburbs tend to be much more segregated than the core cities, as people get sorted to different neighborhoods by income, by tenure, and housing type. Affluent suburbs are attractive not only because of housing, but they also tend to offer better school, safer streets, and richer sets of amenities. Many families choose their home location not only based on the house characteristics, but also the other environmental characteristics, and schools are important in the decision-making process. Low-income suburbs tend to offer schools where the academic performance is lower, amenities, and there are less amenities, and also the role models for children that support social mobility tend to be less as well. Hence, we can see that suburbs become much more segregated with time, and this is one of the biggest urban planning challenge that many cities face. In Europe, these areas are specifically characterized by modernist housing estates that are built from the 1960s through the 1980s. These suburban complexes are common in many European cities such as Paris, Stockholm, as well as Tallinn, and they need special attention to tackle effectively urban inequalities and segregation. We will return to these topics in the second part of our lecture course, which explicitly focuses on segregation processes and how these estates shape the opportunities over time. Similarly to suburbanization, counter-urbanization is mostly about environmental and lifestyle factors too, being sometimes referred to as the amenity-driven migration, related to the attraction of nature, slower lifestyle, and calmer living environments. However, more detailed studies have shown that the process of counter-urbanization is also very complex, and we can identify several reasons why people move away from cities to smaller towns and more distant rural locations. First, population aging plays an important role. As people get older, the variety of opportunities and services that cities offer become less relevant. For example, older adults no longer need live close to universities or playgrounds, kindergartens, and schools of children. When people retire, they no longer need to live near the workplaces either. So, as their life circumstances change, and when the health is still good, many people begin to value peace, quiet, and contact with nature more than the intensity of urban life. This encourages people to move away from cities. Recently, this trend has become even stronger due to climate crisis and increasing heat waves that affect stronger older people. Many people also have second homes or summer homes, and they use them only seasonally when they are still working in the cities. However, after retirement, second homes may become the first homes. Still, many people who move to the countryside also keep their urban apartments, either passing them to their children or renting them out to supplement retirement income and maintain their standard of living. Second, internal migration also relates to economic cycles. At times of economic boom, when new housing is going up, credit is cheap and jobs are plentiful, urbanization tends to accelerate. However, at times of economic downturns, the reverse often occurs. People may lose jobs or incomes may get reduced, but the cost in living in the city are still high, so moving out becomes a survival strategy. In 1990s, for example, in East European, when the big societal transformations took place, many people also left the cities because of the survival strategy. Furthermore, the term counter-urbanization was popularized by the American geographer Brian Berry in the 1970s as US cities began to lose population during the times of the global oil crisis. Again, because of the survival strategy, many people left from large cities seeking more affordable and lower cost areas. In other words, cities tend to be less resilient to different types of crises compared to the rural areas. For example, more recently, a similar pattern was observed during the coronavirus period, when many urban households were seeking refuge from less densely populated small towns and rural locations. Third, counter-urbanization can also be seen as part of the rising house prices in cities, pushing both lower and middle-income people out of the cities. Not only house prices in urban cores, but also in the suburbs, along with the intensification of the suburbanization, are going up. And so lower-income families seek affordable homes and housing from more distant locations. This extends the commuting zone of the major cities, and growth along the main railway corridors is one way to balance more affordable housing with continued good access to urban jobs. Finally, digital transition offers new opportunities for rural areas as well because of the opportunities of teleworking. We still do not fully know how teleworking will shape people's residential choices in the long term, but some trends can be identified. Families, as well as professionals who no longer need to commute daily, have relocated from big cities to smaller towns where other amenities are available, most importantly, the kindergartens and schools for children. So these are the ideal places for families who seek environment that is good to raise children, but also where houses are more spacious and allow easier to work from home. As people move to more rural areas that are attractive, it's a phenomenon that has been called as rural gentrification. That is, rural areas also change as people living an urban lifestyle are pouring to the countryside. Some of the attractive areas are also coastal areas like in the cities as well as islands, and in Estonia, western parts of the country as well as islands are also a good examples of such types of residential mobility. Even when rural areas lose population overall, migration flows are getting more diversified. Indeed, many rural areas suffer from outmigration, while many are gaining residents, both elderly as well as families with children. We can also see that rural life is changing. Traditional jobs continue to decline, partly because of automatization in sectors such as agriculture and forestry, and urban lifestyles increasingly expand to the countryside. More broadly speaking, rural areas are becoming spaces of residence and consumption rather than places of production as they have traditionally been. In terms of residence, both first homes and second homes are becoming more popular, and second homes are now used beyond the summer season. People often spend extended weekends there and may work remotely. As spaces of consumption, rural areas are also seeing expanding tourism. Furthermore, many large farming units are transforming to new use cases that span from residential uses to commercial facilities. To conclude, we are living at a time of intense urbanization. This process intensified in the middle of the 20th century and will likely to continue until the end of the 21st century. Urbanization is driven by many factors, but as countries urbanize overall, the migration flows become also more diversified, and processes such as suburbanization and counter-urbanization add diversity to the migration flows. Thank you very much for the listening, and in our next lecture we will continue with the new topics that relate to climate change and digital transition as related to population mobility and residential choice.